Michael Rosen is an English children's novelist, poet, and hugely best-selling author of over 140 books. His first book of children's poems was published in 1974, and he's gone on to write numerous and award-winning children's books, such as Quick, Let's Get Out of Here, We're Going on a Bear Hunt, and Chocolate Cake. Alongside this, he performs, teaches, lectures, presents word of mouth on BBC Radio 4, and reviews books for The Guardian. He was Children's Laureate from 2007 to 2009 and founded the Roald Dahl Funny Prize in 2008 to honour books that make children laugh. He found time in his busy schedule to meet with Nikki and talk about his career and his latest title, A Dog's Tale.
This is an old dog talking to a young dog. So in the back of your mind you might have a thing about old dogs teaching new dogs tricks, young dogs tricks and all that. So old dog and young dog, and obviously we're just on the brink of something. We're not quite sure what. The young dog is about to go off somewhere into the world. We don't quite know how or why. And the old dog offers advice to the young dog. The old dog says that, all sorts of things might be out there. There might be frisbees to catch and nice tastes and things out there. Sometimes you find that maybe you get knocked down or something happens, people leave from your life. The key thing then is kind of how you get up, really, how you deal with it and whether you talk to other people. And then if you do talk to other people, you suddenly find that people want to talk to you too. And the key thing is to follow your nose. Ha ha ha, dogs' noses, ha ha. And, when you've got a bowl of food, maybe it's not a bad idea to share it. So there it is. It's all very homely, maybe homey and homely. That's the story, with wonderful, wonderful pictures full of humanity and emotion from Tony Ross.
Yeah, it is. It's beautiful. And in a way, it's a manifesto for life. It may look like a picture book for young children, and it certainly is that, but anybody can take something from this. And as I was reading it, I felt it covered all aspects of agency, wide open-heartedness, hope, fear, travel, adventure, finding your own voice, being resilient, being fair in the world. And it put me in mind, would you believe, of Martin Luther King, who talked about the broad education being not only to transmit accumulated knowledge, but also the accumulated experience of social living.
Yes, it's very easy to think of education as just the transmission of knowledge, and also to not even think very much about how that's done. But of course, even as we're transmitting knowledge, we are transmitting values. We're saying who's important, who's not important, who's heard, who's not heard. So though sometimes governments and people in charge of education talk about values, when they do talk about values, they imagine somewhere or other you put up a poster that says, here are our values, you give a little talk in assembly, and then you've done values. Mm-hmm. But in actual fact, schools transmit values almost before you walk through the school gate, and then once you walk through the school gate, there are all the values all around you. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's nice to do a book that is, in a way, not a story, though it has got a sort of story, but that is about values, because it's very hard, actually, to it's quite funny, really, when you think that's where education started, with the transmission of values, when you think about the Puritans and what they were doing in the 17th century. That's what they thought they were doing. They were teaching the words of Jesus Christ, and that was the job of education. So it's quite funny. We went all the way out into great chunks of knowledge, because otherwise how could you approach the world? And then people going, oh, hang on a minute, you do need values, don't we? I think the horrors of the middle of the 20th century should have reminded us about that. But yes, we are thinking about values.
Absolutely. And this obviously is about, your story, A Dog's Tale, is in one sense about the education that goes on within the home. It's about family and those values being situated within the family. Within the school then, what do you think, in your view, and I am asking really for a personal opinion, what's the principal role of education in schools, do you think?
Well, I think you start with society. There's this rather strange thing that we've got caught up with, particularly with the PISA international tables, that education is talked about purely in terms of who is the most successful at transmitting high score maths performers and the like. And so you get government ministers quite often saying, oh, look what they're doing in Shanghai, look what they're doing in Singapore, without any reference to the societies where that's going on. Within the same newscast, you might be listening to the Today programme, and you'll hear somebody saying, isn't it marvellous what the Chinese children do? In actual fact, those stats are about Shanghai children, highly selected, but never mind. But that's what those stats are about. And then a few minutes later, you'll hear about some awful human rights story coming out of China. And you think, well, if we talk about education, you have to keep in mind what sort of society has given birth to this education system and what kind of society we want. So at some level or another, this is apparent to government, but they will keep returning to the idea that there is something called pure education that is value-free. So I don't think that's possible. I think that you have to consider the values that you promulgate, that you imply in how you treat children. Education is predominantly adults talking at children. It hasn't changed in 3,000 years. So then you have to then build into your consciousness, well, if these children are growing into adults and these adults are going to be making up society and running society, how do we want them to be? And so what voice do they have is absolutely crucial. And we keep hearing all the time, I was listening to the news this morning about the excluded from universities. Well, why is that? Why were certain people, how did they arrive at 18 and were not able to apply, or even if they wanted to apply to university, why did they feel excluded? Why were they excluded? In what way were their voices not heard? Or alternatively, what did they not get on the way? And why was that? So the concept of education is inseparable from the discussion about democracy. So I don't think we have that conversation very often. That what is education to do with democracy? That we have a lot of stuff about bringing on the individual, empowering the individual, whatever. But it seems to me that you also have to talk about how people have a voice, share voices, come to decisions, make decisions, how people chew over difficult things and decide things together. Here we are, right in the midst of perhaps the worst thing I've ever seen in my lifetime, and I'm 73, where quite clearly a country doesn't know how to make a decision. I'm not suggesting it's easy by any means, but that's clearly what we don't know how to do. One solution was a referendum, and then there was another solution, which was leave it to Parliament. These are both instruments of democracy, and they're both not working. So in other words, democracy itself is up for question. Well, I would say, let's go back to education and think, why is it that we're finding this difficult? Maybe we're not actually very good at democracy. Maybe we say we are because we've got the mother of all parliaments. Maybe we're not very good at it. Maybe we're very good at hierarchy, very good at being told what to do in quite submissive ways that I'm sometimes quite horrified by. So, yes, I think education should be intimately connected to the discussion about democracy.
Absolutely fascinating, and the whole structure of the way in which a school is put together, and not just the content of what it teaches, are somebody once said there are two kinds of knowledge going on in schools. There may be more, but this person, his name was Kevin Harris, I think. And he said there's knowledge one and knowledge two. Knowledge one is this stuff, these textbooks, look, here they are. It's the teacher saying, here is what you need to know. That is knowledge one. But knowledge two is how the institution is run. And when you are a student, let's anyone think back, in fact, as a child or as a secondary school student, I mean, we spent hours talking about how the school was run amongst each other, who bosses who around, how you get a detention, how do you get off a detention, who got the cane, because it was still in the era of the cane, who decided, what happened to that boy who was excluded, etc., etc. All these were actually questions in the Knowledge 2 framework. Famously, Frank Whitehead wrote a book called The Disappearing Days, which was in a sense about that. We have different ways of expressing this thing. So when my father, who was born in 1919, talked about school, he described those old London 4-storey buildings with the big halls. I didn't realise this, with the classrooms off. All the classroom doors were open, and at the end of the hall, in each one of the halls, was the head teacher's desk. The head was peripatetic from hall to hall,
would sit at the desk and listen to what was going on in each of the classrooms, sometimes walk round looking in, and then go upstairs to the next one and to the next one. If he saw anything wrong, and it was a man in his primary school this was, if he saw anything wrong, then he would beat the child. So built into that is a certain politics, a set of values. And my father remembered on one occasion Mr. Hadida, the head teacher of Myrtle Street Primary in about 1923, walking past the classroom. My father had just done a little test, looked back across to somebody else and mouthed, "Have you finished?" You see, the boy nodded, Mr. Hadida saw it, pulled my dad out and whacked him. Now, in that little incident that my father loved to recount, there are a whole set of values. Now, we haven't got rid of values, we have created other ones. Head teachers by and large don't do that anymore, obviously. But at the same time, as you said, there's a structure. How is that structure decided? Who decided that we would have these vertical structures in academies that are different from local authority? Who supervises academies? All these should be part of how we discuss the very nature of what it feels like to be a pupil in a school. I noticed the other day, Dylan William, professor, was at the Institute of Education, I think is now around and about as a consultant, and he posed the issue of whether the how of education is as important, or if not more important, than the what for the student. And now I've said this on several times, that the curriculum as it's produced by the government is different from the curriculum as perceived by the child or the student. I see that. I've got a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old. What I see it here from what the government says is being taught and what they're being taught. I mean, if a teacher is, I know it sounds trivial, if a teacher is absent for a week, that is the curriculum. That week you've got a supply teacher. If you had a supply teacher for 3 weeks, then it starts getting a bit serious, doesn't it? So anything that is in the child or the student's experience is actually the curriculum they got from 3 to 16 or 18. So I think we need to address that and say, and be more realistic about what is the curriculum, and also what are these two areas of knowledge, knowledge one, knowledge two, and how that relates to the society we want.
I think I'd feed in there that there's another aspect of knowledge that often doesn't get talked about, and that is that it's only information.
Yes.
Until you are able to make something of it yourself, you're the person that turns that into knowledge.
Yes. Well, that's a crucial philosophical idea about how we think and what is consciousness that you raised there, Nikki. Because if you take what is essentially a one-to-one relation, there is knowledge, there is the child, let's say, and knowledge just goes from jug to mug, as we used to say, the jug and mug theory of education. The child is the empty mug, the teacher or the textbook is the full jug. You pour the jug into the mug, sorted. Then you have no agency for the learner. So what is learning? Is it just receiving? Well, no, I don't think any psychologist of any kind would actually think that that's how consciousness works. There has to be somewhere or another in which, right from the time we're born, we have, whether you call it a construct or a schema or an arrangement, whatever you call it in the brain, that enables you to process and vitally to interpret what you receive. So when you see a newborn baby, and I've seen one at close quarters recently because I've become a granddad, and you see...
Congratulations!
Well, thank you. So when you see a baby, a newborn baby, and I remember this with mine, what do these newborn babies do? You see them peering. I mean, it's quite unearthly. You see them peering at the world, staring around, and I mean, I know it's an assumption to make, but it really does. You can see this child trying to figure, and you know, though it is only 9 months since conception, that you can see them. They are in a new environment, and they're trying to perceive what's going on. And any breastfeeding mother will tell you, and I've seen it at close quarters, the baby makes choices very, very quickly about which side they want to be on and what's nice and what's not nice, and boy do they tell you. So again, right from the very beginning, we are these interpreting, thinking beings who are trying to process what the world is. And this goes on for the rest of our lives. And if we just think of the child learner as just a receiver, then we misunderstand and misinterpret who we are. I mean, there are times that we are more passive than others, I guess we could say, though perhaps you could even argue about that, we just let something sink in, or at least that's what we tell ourselves. But still, the brain has got to work. It's got to fit it in somewhere, what model of the brain we have, in order to make it work for the person we have become. So there's a constant interpretation thing, and those of us in the world of children's books, we cannot possibly think, if we're writers, illustrators, makers of children's books, that somehow or other children just pick up one of these things and go, right, I know what to do now, I've received that. They process it. I mean, if you watch children poring over an illustrated book, a picture book, they have a big problem to do. They have to relate the words they hear to the pictures they see. These are two different things. They're not the same. And really, the pictures are not illustrations. They're telling a separate story. Looking at the dog's tail, this one dog's spotty, the other dog isn't. So immediately you're looking at two different dogs. One dog's bigger than another one. It doesn't say big dog, little dog, so you've got to interpret that. Looking at Tony's picture here, there's little lines next to the dog's tail. It doesn't say in my text, the dog is wagging its tail. So you have to have the interpretive mechanism to know what little lines by a tail means.
I don't think it says it's a parent, but you assume it's a parent.
Well, or not. You might be big bro, might be big sis.
Sure.
So again, that's all space for you to do. I was involved in a book called Going on a Bear Hunt. It doesn't say anywhere in the text who the people are. So a child looking at it has got to work that out. When you come to the last picture of the bear walking away in a sort of slummocky look, children come to me over and over again and say, why is the bear sad? What is the bear thinking? And I say, well, what do you think? And then they tell me. In other words, they interpret it. So all these acts of interpretation, and I think that's why picture books are particularly powerful, because they constantly invite the child to relate the logocentric thing, language, that kind of symbolism, the symbolism of words, to the symbolism of picture. These are two different acts of symbol making, and we invite children to try and make them work together. So someone once called that a relay action, a relay between the words and the pictures, back to the words and pictures, words and pictures. How do you make it work? Where the wild things are. When it says in Where the Wild Things Are, Max wanted to be where someone loved him best of all, why does Maurice Sendak say someone? Who is someone? So this is not one-to-one. It doesn't say, here is a fact, now just absorb it. It says someone. That invites you to think, who can that someone be? You might decide it's this anonymous figure who's not in the book, the mother, or you might decide it's, I don't know, a nice monster, or a brother, or a tree. I mean, it's totally open to you as a child reader, a 2-year-old, or in fact a 102-year-old, to think who that someone might be. And after all, if it's the mother, that's not uncomplicated either, because the only thing the mother's done is detach from the child and sent him to his room. So if he wants to be where someone loved him best of all, does he want, as it were, inverted commas, a better mother, a nicer mother who doesn't detach him? He comes back and there's some hot food. Who's that come from? Sendak doesn't tell us. So the child's got to say, oh, I know where that's come from. Oh, right, where? It was a dog. Or who? And there aren't really right and wrong answers to that. There are possible interpretations.
Thinking about the role of reading and books in education, again, thinking about some of the things that get left out of the discussion. We often talk about the genre and the range of children's reading and how language is constructed. We don't often, or as far as I'm aware, talk about the voice and who's actually talking to you, and surely it is about two voices meeting, the reader and the writer. And that's what we have in here. We have a voice of an older dog, we assume, talking to a younger dog. We've got the voice of you talking to the child reader. And this must surely be one of the most important things in literature.
Voice is fantastic. It's a really, really interesting question, because we have ways of producing fiction where the voice appears to be invisible. This is the so-called omniscient narrator, the once upon a time that is invisible. It just somehow is the language, the world of story. Once upon a time there was a poor woodcutter and his wife, and they were very, very poor, and they had 2 children called Hansel and Gretel. And this is invisible. And then, of course, the more you look at that, you discover that it isn't invisible. It's actually the very, very agenty hand of the brothers Grimm, who changed the story, Hansel and Gretel, several times in order that it should be the way they wanted it, so that it's very authored. But you hide because we've invented this anonymous voice. It's quite interesting. When you go back to bardic poetry, you go back to Beowulf and the Odyssey, there is that invisible voice, but quite often voices are given to participants. So it's the soliloquy principle that are in those epics. So if you see the Odyssey, at one point Odysseus goes to see a king, and the king asks him what you've been up to, and then Odysseus spends the next at least half an hour telling him a whole huge shenanigans. So suddenly you have this notion of a story that can be multi-voiced. There can be the omniscient narrator, then you can have this unreliable, dodgy bloke, Odysseus, who after all, he didn't need to do that stuff to Polyphemus, and he didn't need to shout, "It was me," which has caused him all the bother anyway. So we have him as a storyteller within the story. So that's very interesting as well. And then obviously you come to Shakespeare, and you have at times narrators. If you think at the beginning of Romeo and Juliet, 2 houses equally alike in dignity, or however it goes. So you have a sort of narrator, and then you have soliloquies. So you hear Juliet's voice, you hear Romeo's voice. So you have a chance to weigh up narrators against each other. At the beginning of the novel, you get very interesting. Instead of that omniscient narrator, you get the self-conscious narrator. So you get in Henry Fielding, Tom Jones, you get a voice that says, "Oh, now what shall I do with my hero now? I really don't know. Shall we send him on the road to London, or shall we do this?" So it's playing with the narration. Now you come forward to children's literature, and we now have a multiplicity of ways of narrating children's books. I mean, think of Mallory Blackman's wonderful Noughts and Crosses. Whoa, we haven't got a narrator. We've got the 2 main participants talking. Where am I? I'm lost. So it's nice and challenging. What's the truth? Maybe the truth lies somewhere in some amalgamation. And so, yes, voice is crucial, and of course voice from the point of view of the reader, whether the reader feels included in that voice, whether they can relax in the sort of warm flow of the voice because it feels like a teacher, parent, whatever. So I find that very interesting also in relation to song and popular song. So if you take Adele, so Adele basically writes soliloquies, and people ask her, and she will explain the base of the experience it comes from. But then when you look at the song and look at the words, it's not exactly Adele, it's the persona that she wants you to know about her, that she may have been in this sort of a state, or she may not have been. Anyway, she's not naming names. So it hangs in this lovely sort of land of the personal, in which a lot of people feel she is speaking for you, because it feels like it's come from her, but somehow or other it isn't quite her. It's in this sort of magical land of this constructed place of the song. So I'm very interested in all that thing about voice and what people respond to in visceral ways. That's me. And sometimes in more analytic ways, say with Mallory, where you can be visceral one moment, and then suddenly you've got to hear the other person's point of view. I don't want to hear their point of view. I want to stick with this one. But she is in a way forcing you to listen to another point of view. And that in its own way is actually very Shakespearean. That's exactly what Shakespeare does.
And I think also, I mean, I don't necessarily want you to comment on this, but I often think, Anthony Brown's book Voices in the Park, which is told in 4 voices. I always say actually there are 5 voices or 6 voices here, because you can't ignore Anthony Brown's voice.
Yeah.
That's probably the strongest voice of them all.
Well, it hides, doesn't it? I've often thought that when you look, say, at Anthony Brown, right, so there's this concept of free indirect discourse. Free indirect discourse is started off with Emma Bovary, really, but it's also in Jane Austen, actually. But anyway, this is where you go into the person's head without saying it. So you don't say she thought, you just slide into it. So Nikki and Michael were talking. Let's say you're the main focalizer, Nikki. So then it was suddenly, I wonder what he's wearing today. We might even do that. She wondered what, but you can take out the she wondered and the I wondered and just go, what should she do later? So you can have these different ways of expressing thought. So when you do that, it's actually very interesting because it's neither the narrator nor the character, it's a mixture of both. Now, when you look at Anthony Brown, let's say in Piggy Book, you've got somebody with pig's ears. It's as if Anthony Brown is saying, that is where that person is at in the mentality they've got. Now, what's brilliant about it, that very complicated idea can be perceived by a child immediately. They go, oh, look, he's got having piggy thoughts. But it doesn't say that. So it's in a way a form of this free indirect discourse done through image. And I think because he's used the vehicle, the medium of surrealism, it's wonderful because you accept it. I mean, I can remember my now much older children weeping with laughter at Piggy Book and some of the others because they spotting that the image was telling you where the person was at in their mentality. And surrealism is one of the vehicles very good in art that enables you to do that. If you look at Magritte, is one of the inspirations for Anthony. You think of the man, I think it is, looking in a mirror and you only see the back of his head. And then you think, well, no, that's impossible. Then you think, well, what is that man thinking? Is that man thinking, I don't want to see my face? Is that man thinking, I'm ashamed of my face? So suddenly you're in this kind of free indirect discourse area. You're in the area of voice. And what is that person thinking? And it isn't telling you. You have to work that out for yourself. I love that. I love that.
I want to talk about an area that I think is quite problematic. We've talked about how important agency is for children within their own education, and then we come to reading and all the discussion around what children should be reading. And looking here at your wonderful reinterpretation of children's classics, we've got Bar Humbug and Unexpected Twist, both of which obviously come from what would be recognised as text within the canon. How does that fit alongside this notion of children having choice, and yet we do think there are things that we want them to experience and encounter?
I sometimes think with this creating of a canon, there's several things that go on. On the one hand, there is a deliberate, specific method of creating a canon that is tied up with universities, critics, and a long tradition of people laying down the law. I went to Oxford University where they told us that English literature began with the Anglo-Saxons. I mean, I couldn't read it, it didn't seem very English to me, but that was Oxford University saying that's where it begins. There was a very ideological notion about the history of English, and that's the way we had to learn it. It also ended at 1900 because they decided that only half of Bernard Shaw was available to us. Anything he wrote after 1900 we shouldn't read. The fact that he was Irish, of course, missed it. They didn't quite notice that bit, but anyway. So
he lived in Buckinghamshire.
Yes, exactly, that's right, yes. So it was all very ideological. Now, that said, so there are systems by which the canon is produced. It's called canonicity, isn't it? So these are produced by critics of one kind or another nearly always, and then sometimes off the back of that then people say, well, it'll be good for you to read it. These things seem to be slightly disconnected. I don't think that you can just simply say that because a group of people over 200-300 years, whatever it is, have decided that this is great literature, that therefore it will somehow, you have to read it and it'll make you better. Not necessarily. I mean, I would just say that it should always be up for discussion. But then alongside that, we have to say that there are popular traditions of canonising. So if you take A Christmas Carol, so what happened, and Oliver, both of them, is that they've been canonised in a different way through popular culture. So through musicals, through the Muppets, through the rest of it. And then that seems to me, it's like two wheels. You've got the literary wheel that is saying there's the canon, and then meanwhile alongside it you've got this popularising. Let's turn it into a musical, let's do sketches, let's the rest of it. So everybody knows who Scrooge is, everybody knows that Oliver says more. And so I find myself sort of batting between the two as someone who's a product of this high culture, education, and at the same time a great lover of popular culture. And children's literature is in an ideal position to span the two and to produce its own forms. So I was very excited to do these two books and to chew them over in ways that could span the two and possibly be a bridge for those who want to read the original without being deifying about it. I mean, it's crazy to deify Dickens, in any way at all. There's all sorts of imperfections as with any writer, so there's no need to say, oh, Dickens, let's all bow down in front of it. There are severe problems in Oliver Twist with Fagin. You can't get away from it. When he first produced Fagin, his descriptions of Fagin, and indeed of someone later in the book, this vile, he keeps using the word vile Jew. He uses the phrase, the vile Jew, many times. And someone tapped Dickens on the shoulder, I forget now, I think it was Bulwer Lytton, and said, I don't think this is a good idea, Charles. And he said, good Lord, what have I done? And so he modified it a bit, but it's very interesting if you compare the two. So in Unexpected Twist, I have a girl in a class who challenges, why are we reading this? She says to the teacher, this is racist. So in fact what I've done is tried to set up a dialogue in both books where modern children are dialoguing with Dickens. So I've in a sense created a situation in which students can have a dialogue with Dickens in a way that's a more active reading than just saying, this is great, read it. I mean, I was a bit disconcerted that my own son did Oliver Twist at school, and at no point was the figure of Fagin problematised. That's not to say you should ignore it or that you should ban it or anything like that. I would always say, with any piece of old literature, problematise it. In other words, say, why is it this way? Othello, is this a play? What does this say about, at this time, the way in which people of Moorish, whatever that meant, what does it mean anyway? Does it mean North African? Does it mean African? What does it actually mean, and where do we stand in relation to that now, and what is Shakespeare's time? Problematise it. Don't just go, we don't want it, or for that matter, the alternative method by some, which is to sort of ignore the fact that it's a problem. So I always say, well, yes, let's get into it and explore it, for in its time and in our time. There's a dynamic that goes on.
Completely agree so strongly with that. I mean, I've recently been reading Oscar Wilde's fairy tales, including The Birthday of the Infanta.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Well, it's often not collected because it has an image of disability within it that would not pass any kind of publishing censorship today. And it's easy to look back and dismiss that. But then when you look at something like Ripley's, which is really common now, and is in a sense a 21st century Victorian freak show, people think that that's okay. So by putting these two together, you can start to ask, well, which has the higher moral purpose, if you think one of them does or not? Because, Wilde was definitely on the side of the dwarf in The Birthday of the Infanta.
Right.
But it's so easy to dismiss it because that image is not acceptable today.
Yes, indeed. Well, quite often, I mean, and fiction is always complicated. I mean, I'm always interested in getting into arguments about The Merchant of Venice, and people go, oh, of course it's anti-Semitic, of course it is. And I go, well, actually, there's a bit of a problem if you just simply say a book or a play or whatever, it is that. Because one thing, we see the humanity of Shylock when he says, do I not prick me, do I not bleed? But also, the others don't behave any better. If anything, they behave worse. So, insofar as Shakespeare, if we can create this notion, and it's the same for any author, me, anybody, which is, you don't express one viewpoint through fiction, you express several, and you leave people with things to discuss. So we might imagine that anybody, whether now in a class or at the time, you come out of Merchant of Venice and go, oh, God, Shylock, oh, he'd have ripped the heart out, yeah. And then you go away and you carry on thinking, you know that bit where Portia goes all about mercy? She wasn't very merciful, though, were they? Because he was chucked out and had no money and he lost his daughter and all the rest of it. And Antonio, he was supposed to be really sort of lovely and, fine, but he didn't behave very well. So you're left with debates You know, the very first time you see Antony in Antony and Cleopatra, just before he comes on, two soldiers go something like, I can't get the words exactly right, something like, here's the triple pillar of the world transformed into a strumpet's fool. And then on comes Antony, and quite often the way it is, he's all dressed up and he's all his gear, and you go, hang on, he looks like a rather important general. So suddenly you have a conflict of ideas. Now, when we write for children, I love the idea that you can create these conflicts of ideas that may not totally resolve, so that you leave the child reader, the young person reader, with some debates. If you tie it up too much, I think it can appear facile anyway. So with the Dickens, I've tried to create debates there for the child reader. So with Bar Humbug, the boy has to come to terms with whether his father is Scrooge-like. Well, you don't want to think your father is Scrooge-like. Is he? Isn't he? Is he just trying to do the best for his family? So it sets up a debate about hard-working, overworking, madly, crazily overworking dads, because there's several aspects to Scrooge. One is that he's obviously mean about money and everything, but also that he's so work-obsessed that he can't live. So there's a kind of interesting subtext to Dickens, which may even reflect on himself, because he was a complete workaholic, that sort of turns his back on family life and conviviality. So that's the theme that I've run through there. And with Oliver, it's really a book about vulnerability, that Oliver is incredibly vulnerable throughout. Otherwise there's no story. The vulnerability of Oliver is crucial. So I've created a girl, Shona, who is vulnerable. So at every turn, it's possible that circumstance or the situation will crush her. So I've sort of tried to make a link between the vulnerabilities.
Brilliant. So Michael, it's been absolutely fascinating, it always is, talking to you today. And we may have seemed to have strayed far from these books, but I don't think we have. I think we've gone to the heart of what children's books are about, and I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Nikki. Thanks very much.